to our next speaker will be one of our workshop leads, Chris Culbert, who, as I mentioned earlier, works at NASA's Johnson Space Center. Chris has served in many roles, including chief technologist, but he stepped away from that role a few years ago to become the manager of the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, also known as CLPS. And this is an exciting program and relevant to our Mars question because it represents a new paradigm for how we are going to start exploring the surface of the moon. And so interesting to think about lessons learned from that and whether that can help us think about exploring the surface of Mars. So thank you very much, Chris, for agreeing to speak with us, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Abby. All right, so, you've heard this before, and now for something completely different. I should probably start with a warning that more than one industry person has told me, anybody who stands up in front of you who's worked for the government their whole life and tells you about commercialization, you should take it with a grain of salt. So this is going to be a little bit from a perspective of NASA, but I think it helps set some of the context we'd hope to discuss during the workshop. So I'll start with some questions. What does commercialization mean? And it turns out there's really not a lot of consensus about that. It can mean a lot of different things. Some obvious ones: private enterprise involved in space-related activities, making profit from space, private-public partnerships. I can find people in the government very quickly tell you if you're doing fixed-price contracting, you must be doing commercial services. The lack of government support. If the government not involved, the government's not paying the bills, does that make it commercialization? I think I'm going to argue all of these are aspects of commercialization. The challenge is picking the portions of it that are meaningful and useful in the context you care about. So I'm going to put a little context to this from a NASA perspective, and I want to go way back in time. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit from both human spaceflight and science mission perspectives, because how we've addressed commercialization inside the agency isn't necessarily the same. And it's fair to note that NASA's terminology about commercialization, approach to commercialization, ideas about commercialization have not been consistent, not just over time, but across programs and areas of interest. But let's go way back in the early days of NASA. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, all of those are thought of as NASA missions led, designed, created, organized by NASA. But every step of that way had commercial partners. There were commercial companies engaged. All the big names we know today, some of them were small names back then, they're big companies today. There were clearly commercial elements involved all the way through that process. The same was true of the shuttle. Rockwell built the shuttle. International Space Station, Boeing is the current prime contractor for space station. So commercial was a portion of all of these early human spaceflight missions. We can say the same about earlier science missions. All of them had prime contractors. The hardware was typically built by somebody who wasn't in the government. In fact, in general, NASA doesn't build a lot of hardware. We buy it from somebody. One of the differences between that and what we might mean by commercialization today is that most of those were designed by a NASA-guided entity. The process was defined and organized and led by NASA. All the approval elements were typically done mostly by NASA, and we paid all the bills by NASA. The commercial companies were typically under cost-plus contracts where they were paid all their costs and they were awarded some small amount of fee. And the amount of profit they make on those kinds of cost-plus contracts isn't necessarily a large percentage. When you're building lots and lots of that hardware over many years, it turns out you can make a lot of money. Just ask Boeing and Lockheed. So that's an aspect of commercialization. Commercial companies have been a part of everything NASA's done from very early on. You begin to see some change in the approach and philosophy in NASA as we get into this century. Orion, the Space Launch System, both look a lot like traditional NASA systems. The guidance, the direction, the funding, the type of contracting is generally similar to what we did in the earlier days. It's not quite the same. Lockheed with Orion has some significant fixed price components to that type of contract. But the schedule is still set by NASA. The design is largely created and organized by NASA. The project schedule and all the processes followed are both sanctioned and monitored by NASA. Where you start seeing it change a little bit more in the human spaceflight arena is when we started talking about commercial cargo and later commercial crew. These were an effort by NASA to change the approach to commercial, where we relinquish control of the process, at least some, to a commercial entity. The way we started those was a somewhat different process as well. They tended to start with Space Act agreements so that we were requiring the vendors to invest some of their own money. So that's another component coming into play, right? Who's investing the money and whose money is engaged. Since both commercial cargo and commercial crew had to dock with space station, NASA still took what I would call a fairly heavy-handed approach towards ensuring human health and protection of our core systems like space station. And of course, with commercial crew, which has taken longer to get going than commercial cargo, that's an even heavier component of the dialogue. But I think you can argue, compared to how we flew shuttle missions, compared to how Mercury, Gemini, Apollo flew, commercial cargo and commercial crew do represent a very different approach towards flying hardware into space, or now flying humans into space, than what we saw in earlier missions. And the resulting capabilities in the hands of commercial vendors allow opportunities for them to sell services or capabilities in markets beside the government. Rockwell was not allowed to sell the shuttle to anybody other than NASA. The Apollo vehicles were all owned by NASA. In these contexts, SpaceX, Orbital ATK own the vehicles, or I guess it's now Northrop Grumman, they own the vehicles they fly to deliver cargo to the space station. SpaceX and Boeing will own the vehicles that deliver crew to space station. Ultimately, they intend to fly cargo and crew that aren't NASA paid for. So you're seeing the emergence of a true commercial market that doesn't feel like the earlier NASA missions. Now, I think I can make a case that some of that's occurred on the science side as well. We're all familiar with the Discovery class, New Frontier flagship type missions. In general, those tend to have some of the feel of the earlier human spaceflight, but the Science Mission Directorate pivoted a little earlier, I would argue, than human spaceflight did, towards allowing a more cohesive approach towards organized. Most of the development and planning for creation of science activities is largely led outside the agency. Teams put together a coalition, they bid on these missions, they select a principal investigator and a team that goes along with them. NASA pays the bill still. NASA still defines the overriding objectives for the mission, but most of the development's led by an entity outside of NASA. And then we went even further in that direction as NASA moved away from the launch vehicle equation, where we put launch service providers in place, where those are commercially bought launch service capabilities. NASA will still contract with the vendor. NASA still provides the framework for how the vendor has to do business, but these are commercial vehicles built by commercial entity and sold to NASA as a service. Commercial lunar payloads that I'm involved in is actually a step even farther down that road. It's for science missions to the moon, and we went even further. In fact, let me go to the next chart here. We went further down that path. For commercial lunar payload services, we built a master contract process, and we're asking the vendors to do essentially the entire end-to-end mission. They own the entire process. We want you to, in a simplistic form, think about FedEx to the moon. I hand you a package, you call me when it's on the moon. It's up to you to decide how it gets there. It's not quite that simple. The analogy breaks down very quickly, but the concept was a good one to illustrate what we had in mind. We want to be a marginal customer. This is one of the other keys. For commercial lunar payload services, we want to be just one of many paying customers. So we can't define the whole mission. We can't own every aspect of the process. Just like in the FedEx model, where your package is one of just 100 that are being delivered that day, we want our payloads to be just one of many. And because of that, we hope to get a much lower cost. The other step we took on CLPS that was breaking from a lot of even commercial cargo and commercial crew was we chose to be very, very hands-off, about as light a touch as you could ever imagine NASA being. We want the commercial market to guide the development and drive the mission process. We don't tell the vendors to use 7120, for example, if you know that terminology. We don't tell them how to build the hardware. My team doesn't even evaluate their lander design. That's up to them to do. We don't use NASA processes. We don't guide development. My team actually isn't even invited to the PDRs and CDRs for the landers. This is all new for NASA. This is not what we're used to. It's fair to say that's causing some turmoil inside the agency, a little bit of heartache once we start recognizing what it is we've done. Clearly, what we're doing is we're taking higher risk, right? We're assuming upfront an acceptance of a higher level of risk, a potential for mission failure that we wouldn't in theory accept if we were in charge of the mission from end to end. In return, we hope what we'll see is lower prices and a faster pace. Nobody's going to accuse NASA missions of going fast or being cheap. We hope by turning more of the process over to commercial entities, we get a better return on investment from the cost and schedule perspective. I'm not going to go a whole lot deeper into CLPS. I'll give you a little bit of a brag sheet. There is some evidence that it's working. About 27 months since we put the original contract in place, we've now awarded 8 task orders for deliveries to the moon, more than 40 payloads, science instruments and technology demonstrations, landings on the moon scheduled for 21, 22, and 23. That's in a little over 2 years, and we've only spent about a little over $500 million. So by any measure we would normally compare to NASA missions, this is ludicrously cheap and extraordinarily fast. Now, I'll give you one big caveat. None of them have actually landed on the moon yet. Until we've landed on the moon, can we really prove this works? Well, that's a valid question. And when we talk from a NASA perspective about going commercialization, this is a big part of the dialogue. How much risk are we willing to take? How do we manage that risk? Do we even manage that risk? And what does that mean in the long run? I think we're confident at these early stages without success, the lower prices have come through. The first 3 missions we chartered were all in the range of $80 million each for delivering in the range of somewhere between 30 kilograms and 100 kilograms of payload to the surface of the moon. By any measure we would normally use, that's dirt cheap. But again, they haven't landed on the moon. Until they land on the moon, can't really claim success. So that kind of takes me to the bigger discussion. And I'm going to throw up a quote I got from Dr. Donahue at Harvard Kennedy School at a workshop we did last summer. He expressed some of the things we've been seeing very well. Contracting and partnerships are really, really different, okay? When you have a contract with a private company, the government's in control, unless, of course, they're screwing up, right? The private company does what it's paid to do. It's fundamental that the government's in charge. In a partnership with a private company, you have to share control. This is something NASA's learning to do under CLPS, very difficult way. We're also learning it with commercial cargo and commercial crew. It has not been an easy thing for us to accept and learn to work with. We can influence the company, we can influence how they do things, or at least provide some suggestions, but we don't control it. And that shared process fundamentally changed the nature of the arrangement and the agreement and the process by how you do everything. So what I'm going to argue is an awful lot about what NASA is doing in commercialization today has more to do with establishing those parameters. Who's responsible for the development cost? Under CLPS, in theory, we're not paying the vendors to develop a capability. We are paying them to deliver our payloads. And we expect over time, after they've developed the first lander and they're just going to fly a second copy, the costs are going to come down. We aren't paying the development cost in that model, and that's a significant change from a cost plus type arrangement. But the more important part of the discussion is risk. Who's managing risk and how is risk managed? CLPS vendors are under firm fixed price contracts, which essentially means the government has shifted cost risk into their hands. They're responsible for deciding how much things are going to cost. If they can make it, if they can complete our requirements at lower cost than they bid, they make a bunch of profit. If they can't complete our requirements for the price they bid, well, they're taking it back. Commercial models need to balance those things effectively. We're too early in our process to say if it works. Commercial cargo and commercial crew are structured somewhat differently, even though they're still firm fixed price. But in those models, NASA chose to give those vendors a guaranteed suite of missions. So while they went through an early competition process to guarantee, to provide competition, once the vendors were selected, they were guaranteed a certain number of missions so that the NASA was taking a heavier share of the cost burden or the cost risk. Schedule risk is also implied in these processes. NASA has relinquished some control of the schedule, and in return for that, hopefully that lowers our cost, but it means that the NASA and the vendor now have to reach consensus when schedule adjustments need to be made. And of course, the last part about who's responsible for building the systems and how the systems are built. We've made very clear that NASA isn't building these systems. I think it's safe to say we've learned from commercial cargo, commercial crew, CLPS already. NASA's level of comfort relinquishing control of that process is, let's say, low level of comfort to begin with to screaming down the hallway type level of comfort. It is hard for the government to get particularly for NASA people, to get its arms around the idea that we're not responsible for the end-to-end system. And we are constantly having dialogues about what that means about risk, what that means about retiring risk, we're about managing risk and resolving responsibilities. All of this plays into any meaningful commercial discussion, though. Commercial companies do this on a daily basis. This is what they have to do. They're balancing it in a different way than NASA would. NASA isn't considering a profit motive as a part of that. They're considering mission success criteria. And that has tended to lead to higher cost and delayed schedules. Okay, so now let's shift a little more. How does all this apply to Mars? So fundamental to any kind of commercialization discussion, and this is the part my vendors beat into my head on a regular basis, you have to identify customers willing to pay for services, okay? If you don't have that, you're either a government entity or you're a charity. And space business doesn't lend itself well to charity. So that's why the government's been the backing for almost all of this from day one. There are some very clear examples, though, in the space industry. Launch services are clearly well-established commercial industry. People are making a lot of money flying rockets. Communications, Earth observations, those are also well-established commercial industries. There is some evidence that a customer base is emerging for low Earth orbit activities, and there's a lot of potential. We all know the companies that are out there trying to capitalize on that opportunity. Low Earth orbit is what NASA has been spending a lot of time for the last 30 years. We know low Earth orbit pretty well now. That knowledge has been well spread and well shared. Commercial companies are ready to take advantage of that. I think you'll see a lot more about commercializing space stations and things like that in the not too far future. There's not as much evidence about a customer base for lunar activities. You might want to ask why NASA jumped out and went ahead and bought commercial services for something nobody's ever done before. That's a different type of discussion that led to some of our interest. But there's enough interest out there to spur investment. Entities like Google X Prize and those types of things, which had excellent corollaries to early aviation industry prizes, had established a framework for companies to start investment, to get support for their investment portfolio, even if the customer base isn't well established yet. And I can say that what we can see on the CLPS project level is that all of the vendors we've awarded task orders to so far are having some level of success selling products and services to other commercial entities outside NASA. Whether that's enough to pay their bills if we weren't around, hard to say, probably not. Google X was around for almost 20 years and nobody came close to getting to the moon, despite the prize money that was out there and a lot of investment being poured into it. It does appear that some kind of an early anchor tenant is necessary to create enough capital to make it worth the investment portfolio. NASA is hoping to do that through things like commercial cargo, commercial crew, and commercial lunar payload services. But now we want to talk about Mars for our workshop, right? So is there commercial interest in Mars? That's probably a little tougher dialogue. I think you can make the storyline, but we haven't flown commercial payloads to the moon yet. We haven't flown people to the moon yet. The obvious ways you could make money off of going to Mars probably have to be demonstrated in cis-lunar space before you can demonstrate them on Mars. I think this will be one of the dialogues that we hope to see emerge over the course of the workshop this week, or next week, is how commercial interests play into the discussion about Mars. But I'm not going to leave it there. I'm going to go a little bit further. I think there are things you can do and that we should explore, even if there isn't a direct commercial market for Mars right now. Can our science interests on Mars take advantage of commercial development for other markets? For example, are the CLPS vendors learning things in the development of capabilities for the moon that could help us revolutionize access to Mars? Are there lessons that they can bring to the table or investments they've made that might facilitate future Mars missions? Flip the equation around the other direction. Is there things NASA could be doing? You know, our choices for exploring Mars, our choices for the science we want to perform, that could be influenced by the way commercial market, how the commercial market is developing capabilities for other needs. If we made some different choices, does that enable us to take advantage of commercial capabilities that were developed for other purposes in different ways? And then even more interesting discussion, because we got into this a lot inside CLPS, how does that feedback loop work? How is it NASA gets to learn what the commercial entities could provide us or need help with? How is it we should look at our science missions? To some extent, that's part of what this workshop's all about. That's an aspect of what we care about, not just define the science, which Don did a great job of opening the door on, and we could spend the whole week just on that. But when we have that dialogue, is there smart ways to look at what other commercial worlds or other capabilities could be brought to bear that don't fall out of the traditional NASA path of developing a mission? So I think that was my last chart. So I actually went a little fast. So I made it for you, Don. we do have some chat questions. All right.
Great, thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, I guess you're right. I can see them. Okay, what is the question is, what is the minimum percent of CLPS missions being successful you to personally to consider the program a success? That's a really, really good question because it's at the heart of the risk equation, right? Here's what I'll say. We've gotten senior leadership all the way up to Dr. Zerbuchin's level and Jim Bridenstine before he left to say in public that as long as we have at least one of our first 2 or 3 missions land successfully, they consider that a success. Now, for NASA, that's a shockingly low return on investment. But we've gotten senior level acceptance that would represent progress in the right direction. Personally, I'm a little more optimistic than that. I'm very impressed with what we've seen out of the vendor pool. I think they can do better than that. But I will also tell you the last 2 countries that tried to get to the moon, Israel and India, both failed. That last step is a doozy. So you can't take it for granted. There's an awful lot of ways to make mistakes. The real question is not so much what the percentage of success is, it's how the agency reacts to a failure. I'm more familiar with the human spaceflight side of the equation. We know what happened when shuttles disappeared, right? Challenger and Columbia both shut down the program for years. Our response to a failure was both corrective, properly so, but also very expensive, very slow, and very time consuming. Commercial markets can't afford that kind of response to failure. So how the agency reacts to early failures will probably dictate a lot to how well our experiment works. And by the way, I should say, Dr. Zerbuchin considers CLPS an experiment. He calls it that all the time. All right, next question. I think one of the risk issues is that with other consumer products, there are some regulation that if your product fails, you can get some kind of restitution. Excellent question. Do we have anything like that with commercial cargo, commercial crew, launch services, or CLPS? That's a very complicated dialogue. In general, NASA creates waivers of liability associated with our missions, and to some limited extent, we can put that in place for the commercial contracts we put out there. But much of that process is not owned by NASA. The FAA, for example, owns most of the launch process. And that's under a different legal framework, and it's probably fair to call that still an emerging legal framework. Liabilities and who pays for problems is, well, here's what the lawyers tell me. Has not yet been proven by law. Until it's been proven by law, you can't take anything for assumption. But the emerging storyline is that liabilities are starting to be worked out, and it won't be as simple as the government guarantees everything. So what we put in place in the early discussions, CLPS, for example, we have a waiver of liability in our CLPS contracts, which says that if they fail their mission, they don't owe us money for the payload they destroyed. But that doesn't cover the commercial payloads. The vendors will have to reach their own agreements with the commercial payloads. Right now, there is no insurance industry for payloads to the moon, as you wouldn't surprise you, right? But that will emerge over time, and the liability question will go hand in hand with a dialogue about insurance and who pays for costs when failures occur. All right, more questions. We got a lot of questions. Excellent. In addition to commercial services at Mars, perhaps another market is the emerging set of spacefaring nations that would like to enter the planetary exploration world. These commercial services could significantly lower cost entry for such new players. You're exactly right. That is very true, and it's happening. Astrobotic, which will be flying one of our first 2 missions, has a payload from Mexico. Multiple of the CLPS vendors are negotiating with the United Arab Emirates for a payload to the moon. So countries which are interested and have the technological ability to build payloads but may not have the infrastructure to build their own launch capability are looking at commercial entities, and you're exactly right. It's lowering the cost of entry for them in significant ways. All right, next question. For the instrument PIs, that's hard to swallow. Yes, Barbara, yes, you're noting that risk level is a dialogue that is, to some extent, we've dragged the instrument PIs into kicking and screaming, right? We didn't go into this with our eyes closed on CLPS. The first round of payloads we took were under the they were low cost. I won't call them throwaway. There's valid and important science that can come from them. But if we lose the instruments, we're not going to lose a ton of sleep. They were low cost. They were readily available. And in general, our intent early on was to try and fly the payloads whose loss would not cripple someone's career. Of course, then we turned around and flew Viper on early missions. Well, we may not have kept to that. I guess instrument PIs have to make 4 of everything. Well, so I'll bring something to the table. So part of what is, pardon the phrase, revolutionizing the lunar dialogue is the recognition that, hey, if we're flying twice a year for the foreseeable future, every instrument doesn't have to be perfect before it goes. And maybe making 4 of them, you might get 3 or 4 chances to fly that instrument over a 6-year period. That changes their approach to the instrument. It changes your approach to the science, I'm going to argue. So yeah, making multiple copies is comparatively cheap sometimes, and it might make a fair amount of sense. All right, yeah, so I try fitting building 4 instruments on Eclipse Prism budget. Well, fair enough. Yeah. But I think the question you really want to get to is, how do we get to a dialogue about what that means in terms of how we approach achieving our objectives? The opportunity to go more frequently can't happen if the price doesn't come down. When the price does come down, you can go more frequently. Then you have to turn the next one around. How does that change how we approach the mission dialogue?
Chris, I'll actually jump in with a question that I'll just ask because
Sure.
I have that purview. I just to give me context, because the whole NASA faster, better, cheaper, which you used 2 of those words multiple times in your talk, was a little bit before my time. And that clearly was something that was attempted and then pivoted away from after it was deemed not working. Were there lessons learned that you're applying for this CLPS project or viewpoint, or is it just so different? And then, is there any reason you think the agency is now willing to accept something that they've said no to before?
Yeah, okay. So I'm old enough to have been around through there. Better, faster, cheaper, pick 2. Yes, I think I would argue we did learn some things in that process. And one of the ways you see that reflected, not just in CLPS, but in commercial cargo and commercial crew, was the recognition that NASA can't control a process and also expect to get different results. And let's be fair, the agency today does not have the same risk profile that we did in the Apollo era. We would not fly, the agency that I'm working for now would not fly the Apollo missions that we flew in the 60s. So recognizing NASA has to relinquish control is certainly one aspect of how better, faster, cheaper is being applied to what we've learned since. I also think that the growth of, it's no longer necessary for NASA to own everything from end to end, because we aren't doing everything for the first time anymore. Now, I will admit these commercial companies will be landing on the moon for the first time, but there's really nothing technologically all that new in their landers. For SpaceX, for Boeing, the commercial vehicles they're flying to space station with commercial crew, there's nothing all that technologically new in those vehicles. It's not like we're having to invent a whole new science this time. So there are things that I think we've learned. Part of it's to rely more upon what industry is capable of doing today compared to what they were capable of many, many years ago. So you'll have to cut me off when we're running out of time here, Abby. There's still more questions coming in.
Yeah, I think we got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay. All right, so would the tolerance for failure influence any decision by NASA to allow use of RHUs and RTGs like systems? Absolutely, and we are having those discussions. And there's two aspects to it. One, what's the regulatory environment for a commercial entity flying an RHU and an RTG? That's never been done before, and we'll be creating new policy and new law when it happens. That won't necessarily be under NASA. The DOE plays a big hand in that. The FAA, of course, will play a big hand in that. But we have not ruled them out. They are in scope for the CLPS contract. We believe it is possible to fly them when the regulatory structure has been put in place that a commercial entity can follow. That's the part that I see is going to take some time. If FAA and DOE and NASA all reach agreement on how the process should be managed, I don't see any hindrance to it, because that process needs to account for the potential for failure and how that's managed by the commercial entities who will be both providing the launch services and ultimately flying the hardware to the moon. Yeah, and then Michelle is noting that she's part of the very first payloads going to the moon, and there are a lot of lessons learned. Michelle, feel free to bring those up as part of the dialogue as we go through this week. It's safe to say that what we did on our first mission, we've already learned a lot ourselves. the missions we are, the task orders we've awarded more recently don't look a lot like the first one we awarded. We've learned some things ourselves about how to manage this process more effectively. All right. Yep, I think that's covered the questions we've got.
I'll actually
Tim's
jump
pointing
in.
out that survive the night's a big deal. Yeah, good.
Can I jump in, and do we have time, Abby, for one more question?
Yeah, time for one more question. Yes, go ahead, Bethany.
All right, I'll take the purview of jumping in since everyone else has exhausted themselves. What do you think, Chris, are the, you mentioned a little bit from a programmatic cost, customer aspect differences between Moon and Mars. What do you think are the biggest technological kind of differences between Moon and Mars in terms of thinking about commercial implementations?
Yeah, so, there's an obvious technological one, right? Landing on the Moon is very different from landing on Mars. Scale makes a difference, and it makes more of a difference on Mars. And in fact, we'll get Michelle to talk quite a bit about that for us later today. But that's an obvious one, right? Mission duration is non-trivial difference too. Missions to Mars are significantly longer. You're going to have to build more robust hardware, and your feedback loops are longer. Your mission control context is more complex. All of those will affect how commercial entities set up to do a Mars mission. Paul Wooster might talk some about this when we get to the third day of the workshop next week, but none of that strikes me as impossible for a commercial entity to resolve. It has more to do with how they trade both the risks and the costs from the return on investment perspective. I think the other big thing that's different is you have to make a much larger investment and plan for a Mars mission because you can't get there in 2 or 3 days and be done with a week, right? I'll give you some other benefits though. The return on investment for doing things on Mars should be extraordinarily high. If you can get activity, if you can return samples from Mars, heck, the market for regolith from the Moon would be through the Moon originally, right? Think what return samples from Mars might bring in the commercial marketplace. Now, that's not necessarily where we're going early on, but somebody's going to go there. Yeah, the commercial potential could be quite high, but that tapers off pretty quickly. You have to have a sustainable marketplace to make it worthwhile in the long run. We're all taking advantage today of billionaires being willing to spend their money to help make things in space, right? That won't last forever either.
Great, good question, and Barbara, yes.
Yeah, good point. Mars is a much different story in planetary protection. All right, thank you, everybody.